Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a fascinating 2025 Supreme Court case from the Philippines, and let me tell you, it reads exactly like a classic David versus Goliath story. Picture this. On one side, you have three incredibly brave overseas workers. On the other, a powerful recruitment agency and a foreign corporate employer. Over the next few minutes, we're going to see exactly how the highest court in the land unpacked a massive, multi-year legal battle over forged documents, huge power imbalances, and a relentless fight for basic contractual justice. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for breaking it all down. We're going to look at the initial bait and switch, ride along the legal roller coaster, tackle the burden of proof, examine some pretty wild forged evidence, see how the law protects vulnerable workers, and finally get to that ultimate verdict.
So Part 1. The bait and switch, which was a massive contractual injustice.
Let's go back to 2013. Three women, Stephanie My Team, Margie Ambin, and Flora Mahane, signed up with a recruitment agency called Technica Skills. They thought they were heading to Saudi Arabia to work as nursing aides. It was an exciting opportunity, right? But imagine showing up at the airport on the exact day of your departure, your bags are packed, you're ready to go, and boom, you're hit with a horrific bait and switch. Under their original government-approved contract, they were promised $400 a month for standard 8-hour workdays. But right there at the airport, they were basically blackmailed into signing a totally different contract. Suddenly, they were demoted to housekeepers. Their work hours surged to 12 hours a day, their term was extended from 2 years to 3, and their pay was drastically slashed. The agency threatened them with hefty fines and told them they'd have to pay back all the deployment expenses if they backed out. So, feeling totally trapped, they felt they had absolutely no choice but to sign.
And that forced signature led to a nightmare. For over 3 grueling years, they were drastically underpaid by their foreign employer, the Arabian Gulf Company. And you know what happened when their contracts finally expired? The company literally refused to let them go home. It's just unbelievable. They were essentially held hostage until Stephanie, Margie, and Flora went straight to the local Saudi police. It took actual police intervention just to get them out of the country. They finally made it back to the Philippines in October 2016, but as you can imagine, they brought a fierce demand for justice home with them.
Which brings us to Part 2. Arriving home was just the beginning of what became a massive legal roller coaster. You'd think stepping off that plane would be the finish line, right? Actually, it kicked off this incredibly confusing and stressful judicial journey. They filed a complaint for underpayment of wages, non-payment of overtime, the whole shebang. Let's trace how this played out in the courts. In January 2017, the labor arbiter gave them a partial win. They got their salary differentials, but were denied overtime and food allowances. Not great. So, they appealed to the National Labor Relations Commission in August 2017 and got a full win. Awesome, right? Well, hold on. In February 2018, the Court of Appeals struck a devastating blow. They completely dismissed the case on a procedural technicality. They claimed the workers failed to file a required comment in time, but the kicker is the workers hadn't even received the notice to file it yet. It was just a total frustrating loss.
But they didn't give up. They took it to the absolute top, leading us to Part 3, the burden of proof and the crucial question of who actually holds the evidence.
At the Supreme Court, this whole battle pivoted on one fundamental concept. Put yourself in the shoes of these workers for a second. Imagine being a vulnerable migrant worker, doing exhausting 12-hour shifts in a foreign country. You finally escape, you get home, and then a court looks at you and says, okay, prove you weren't paid correctly. How do you even do that? You don't have the keys to the corporate filing cabinets in Saudi Arabia. You aren't running the payroll software. How are you supposed to prove a negative?
Well, so, the crucial point is, under the law, you don't have to. In labor disputes, the burden of proof rests entirely on the employer. Why? Because the employer is the one with custody and control of all the personnel files, the payrolls, the bank remittances. It's their legal obligation to definitively prove that the wages and benefits were actually paid. So it was the agency Technica Skills' job to prove they paid the workers, not the workers' job to prove they were shortchanged.
And boy, did the agency try to prove it. This brings us to Part 4, the forged evidence, which turned out to be a massive smoking gun.
Realizing the burden was completely on them, the agency finally scrambled and submitted records to the court. But the Supreme Court took one look at them and, wow, the findings were absolutely damning. First, they noticed identical signatures across completely different months. Then, they saw incomplete daily time records that were entirely handwritten by one single unidentified person, and none of them were actually signed by the workers themselves. But honestly, the most absurd finding? The agency submitted payrolls from April to October 2016, featuring the signature of a coworker named Riza Salvahan.
The tiny little problem with that? Riza had already been repatriated and left Saudi Arabia back in April. Her signature was somehow appearing on payrolls for months when she wasn't even in the country. No way, right?
Now, what's really interesting about this is just how shockingly bad the forgeries actually were. The Supreme Court pointed out that the signature portions of the payrolls for June and July 2013 weren't just similar, they were eerily identical. The placement on the page, the little stray markings, even the erasers were perfectly matched. It was basically a hilariously bad copy-paste job. And because it was so blatantly fake, the court had no choice but to throw those documents out completely.
Moving into Part 5, we see a real shift in tone as the court focuses on protecting overseas workers. With the employer's evidence officially tossed out as forged trash, the court had to figure out how to handle the workers' claims without standard documentary proof. And this is where we see some incredible empathy from the bench. The Supreme Court delivered this powerful statement, saying, "While normally we would require the presentation of payrolls, daily time records, and similar documents before allowing claims for overtime pay, in this case, that would be requiring the near impossible." The court explicitly recognized the massive power imbalance here. Think about it. These women were trapped abroad and had to involve the police just to escape. Expecting them to have perfectly cataloged overtime records, neatly folded in their suitcases, that's just completely detached from reality.
Because of that harsh reality, the court leaned heavily on a foundational labor law principle. Whenever there are doubts arising from the evidence in a controversy between a worker and an employer, those doubts must absolutely always be resolved in the worker's favor. Since the employer's records were proven fakes and the workers provided sworn statements from their coworkers backing up those grueling 12-hour shifts, the court sided with Stephanie, Margie, and Flora. They were officially granted their claims for salary differentials, unpaid vacation leaves, overtime pay, and food allowances.
Let's move to our final section and see how all of this builds into the final verdict.
After nearly a decade of fighting, the Supreme Court handed down a massive, decisive victory. And a key part of this win was the enforcement of something called solidary liability. What does that actually mean? It means the workers don't have to somehow track down the Arabian Gulf Company over in Saudi Arabia to get paid. Nope. Under the law, the local recruitment agency, Technica Skills, and its corporate officers are jointly and severally liable. That meant the agency's president, Cesar E. Pawiano, couldn't just hide behind a corporate shield. He was personally on the hook to make sure these women were paid every single cent they were owed. And here is where their long fight literally pays off. The court ordered a complete restoration of what they should have earned in the first place. Stephanie and Flora were awarded over $24,000 each, and Margie was awarded over $23,000. This accounted for their missing leave, food allowances, and thousands upon thousands in back-owed overtime. To put that into perspective, for overseas workers whose base pay was meant to be $400 a month, these awards are life-changing.
But wait, it actually gets better. The court didn't stop at just replacing the stolen wages, because the recruitment agency acted in such obvious bad faith. I mean, from the airport blackmail to the totally forged courtroom evidence, the court ordered them to pay an additional 50,000 Philippine pesos in moral damages, plus another 50,000 in exemplary damages to each and every worker. Throw in a 10% award for attorney's fees and a 6% interest rate until everything is fully paid, and we're looking at an absolute financial triumph for the petitioners.
So what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? Well, we just watched 3 workers, armed with literally nothing but the truth, take down a powerful multinational employer and local executives at the highest court in the land. The court looked at the messy evidence, saw right through the ridiculous forgeries, and emphatically protected the vulnerable. It leaves you wondering, if this standard of accountability, where the burden of proof strictly and heavily binds the employer, is aggressively applied moving forward, how might this precedent empower millions of other migrant workers around the world to finally demand what they are rightfully owed? It's a pretty powerful question, right? And it's a real testament to the enduring power of justice. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and keep asking the big questions. See you next time.